Montana Territory, 1873. The prairie stretched out in endless waves of gold and green under the vast blue sky, promising land and opportunity to those brave enough to claim it. But Frederick Xavier knew better. The West didn't give, it took. It had been taking from him since he was 15 years old. Frederick adjusted his hat against the afternoon sun as he guided his horse down the winding path towards Silver Pine. 3 years working as a ranch hand had taught him the harsh truth about frontier life. Trust was a luxury and attachment was a weakness. At 26, he'd already seen enough men die from both. The town of Silver Pine appeared on the horizon, a collection of wooden structures clinging to existence at the edge of wilderness. Frederick needed supplies, a hot meal, and maybe a bath before heading back to the Rocking M Ranch. What he didn't need was conversation or company, especially the kind that expected something from him. He'd been raised by a father who believed silence was strength and emotion was weakness. When outlaws had shot his pa dead during a cattle drive, Frederick had learned that lesson permanent. The only people who survived out here were those who kept to themselves and expected nothing. The West was no place for dreaming of more. As Frederick rode into town, dust coating his blue shirt and tan riding pants, he noticed how Silver Pine had grown since his last visit. New construction framed the main street and the sounds of hammering and sawing filled the air. Progress was coming, whether the territory was ready or not. He dismounted in front of the general store, tethering his chestnut gelding to the hitching post. His boots hit the wooden boardwalk with a hollow thud as he straightened his lean, muscular frame. Though young, hard work had sculpted Frederick into a man who commanded respect, with strong shoulders and hands calloused from years of ranch work. His face, despite the light stubble from days on the trail, maintained a youthful handsomeness with sharp blue eyes that missed little. Frederick entered the store, hat in hand, nodding politely to the proprietor before handing over his supply list. While the shopkeeper gathered his items, Frederick's attention drifted to the open door of the adjacent room, a small parlor where the owner's wife served tea to ladies of the town. That's when he saw her. Seated at a small round table was a young woman unlike any he'd seen in Silver Pine before. She wore a modest blue dress with white lace trim, her posture perfect as she sat across from an empty chair. Her long chestnut hair was pinned up in a style that spoke of Eastern refinement, with loose curls framing a face of striking beauty. But it wasn't her appearance that held Frederick transfixed, it was her animation. She was talking. To the empty chair, "I know you don't approve," she was saying, pouring tea into a cup that sat before the vacant seat, "but I've made my decision and I won't be returning east. Montana is where I belong now." Frederick stood frozen in the doorway, watching as she continued her one-sided conversation, gesturing occasionally with delicate hands. She was perhaps 20 years old, with clear hazel eyes that sparked with intelligence despite her apparent delusion. "Miss," he found himself asking before good sense could stop him. The woman startled, her teacup clattering against its saucer as her eyes snapped to his. For a moment, she looked like a deer caught in a hunter's sights, wide-eyed and frightened. Then, her expression transformed to something like mortification. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly as she rose from her chair. "Please don't ask." Frederick stepped fully into the parlor, drawn by something he couldn't name. "Are you all right, miss?" "I'm perfectly fine," she replied quickly, smoothing her skirts with nervous hands. "Simply enjoying tea before continuing my journey." "Your journey?" Frederick asked, curiosity overwhelming his usual reserve. "To Halsted Creek," she said, lifting her chin with sudden determination. "I'm to be the new schoolteacher." Before Frederick could respond, the shop owner called from the main room. "Your supplies are ready, Mr. Xavier." The woman's eyes widened at the name. "Xavier. Are you from the Rocking M Ranch?" Frederick nodded slowly. "I am." "Then we're to be neighbors of sorts," she said, offering a tentative smile that transformed her face from merely pretty to truly beautiful. "I'm Grace Thomas. I arrived on yesterday's stagecoach." She extended her hand and Frederick found himself taking it, feeling its warmth and softness against his calloused palm. For the briefest moment, their eyes met, and Frederick felt something shift within him, like ground giving way beneath his boots. "Frederick Xavier," he replied, releasing her hand perhaps too quickly. "Folks call me Fred." "Well, Mr. Xavier," she said, her smile faltering as her eyes darted to the empty chair and back. "It was a pleasure meeting you, but I really must finish my preparations." Frederick glanced again at the empty chair, the teacup filled and waiting. A dozen questions formed in his mind, but the pleading look in her eyes silenced them all. "Miss Thomas," he said with a nod, placing his hat back on his head, "safe travels to Halsted Creek." As he turned to leave, he heard her soft voice behind him, "Mr. Xavier." He paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Thank you for not asking." The ride back to the ranch should have been uneventful. Frederick had made the journey countless times, knowing each bend in the trail and every landmark along the way. But today his mind wandered repeatedly to the woman in the blue dress, Grace Thomas, the new schoolteacher, talking to an empty chair and begging him not to ask why. It wasn't his business. People on the frontier carried their oddities and secrets, and Frederick had learned long ago not to pry into matters that didn't concern him. Yet he couldn't shake the image of her face, the vulnerability in those hazel eyes when she'd been discovered, followed by that flash of dignified resolve. 3 days later, Frederick was mending fence line when the ranch owner's son, Ethan Morgan, rode up with news. "Pa wants you to escort the new schoolmarm to Halsted Creek," Ethan said, leaning forward on his saddle horn. "Stagecoach dropped her in Silver Pine, but nobody's come to fetch her yet." Frederick's hand stilled on the fence wire. "Why me?" "Because you're heading that direction to deliver those horses to Johnson's place anyway," Ethan replied with a shrug. "And Pa says you're the most respectable-looking of the bunch. Don't want to frighten the Eastern lady with some of our rougher boys." Frederick wanted to refuse. The last thing he needed was to spend hours in a wagon with a woman who talked to empty chairs. But refusing a direct request from William Morgan wasn't an option if he wanted to keep his job. "I'll head out at first light," he said, returning to his work. "Good man," Ethan replied, turning his horse. "Oh, and Fred. She's staying at the widow Henslow's boarding house. Name's Thomas or something like that." Frederick kept his expression neutral. "I'll find her." The next morning found Frederick driving the ranch wagon into Silver Pine. His stomach knotted with a tension he couldn't explain. He'd spent the night alternating between curiosity and dread, wondering what kind of madness might afflict the beautiful woman he was tasked with escorting. The widow Henslow's boarding house sat at the edge of town, a neat 2-story structure with white trim and a small garden out front. As Frederick pulled the wagon to a stop, the front door opened, and Grace Thomas emerged, looking even more striking in the morning light. She wore a practical traveling dress of deep green, her chestnut hair now braided and pinned at the nape of her neck. A small trunk sat beside her on the porch, along with a carpet bag and what appeared to be a wooden crate of books. When she spotted Frederick, surprise flickered across her features, followed by something like resignation. "Mr. Xavier," she said, descending the steps with careful dignity. "I wasn't expecting you." Frederick climbed down from the wagon, removing his hat. "Mr. Morgan sent me to escort you to Halsted Creek, Miss Thomas." "That's very kind, but," she began, then stopped, her eyes darting past his shoulder. Frederick turned, seeing nothing but the empty street behind him. When he looked back, Grace had composed herself, though a slight flush colored her cheeks. "That's very kind," she repeated firmly. "I appreciate the assistance." "Let me get your trunk," Frederick said, moving past her to the porch. As he loaded her belongings into the wagon, he was acutely aware of her watching him, her hands clasped tightly before her. There was a tension in her posture that hadn't been there in the tea parlor, a wariness that made him wonder if her strange behavior in town had been a momentary lapse or something more concerning. Once her luggage was secured, Frederick offered his hand to help her onto the wagon seat. After a moment's hesitation, she accepted, her fingers light against his palm as she climbed up beside him. They rode in silence for the first mile, the wagon wheels creaking a rhythmic accompaniment to the horse's steady pace. Frederick kept his eyes on the trail ahead, though he could feel Grace's occasional glances his way. "How long have you worked at the Rocking M?" she finally asked, her voice soft against the prairie wind. 3 years, Frederick replied. "Came up from Texas with a cattle drive and stayed on." "And before Texas?" Frederick's hands tightened on the reins. "Missouri, lost my folks young. Been working ranches since I was 15. Grace nodded, smoothing her skirts. I'm from Boston originally. My father was a professor at Harvard. She trailed off, her gaze shifting to the empty space on the wagon seat beside her. Frederick pretended not to notice. What brings a Boston lady to Montana territory? Teaching posts must be plentiful back east. The question seemed to draw her back to the present. Adventure, I suppose. A chance to be useful somewhere I'm truly needed, she smiled faintly, and perhaps to prove something to myself. The West isn't kind to those looking to prove something, Frederick said. It tends to test people beyond what they were expecting. I'm stronger than I appear, Mr. Xavier, she replied, her voice taking on an edge of determination. Frederick studied her profile against the backdrop of endless sky and rolling hills. Despite her refined appearance, there was something in her eyes, a resilience that contradicted his initial impression of fragility. I don't doubt it, Miss Thomas, he said finally. Anyone brave enough to travel alone across the country has already proven something. Her smile in response was genuine, transforming her face in a way that made Frederick quickly return his attention to the horses. They had traveled another mile when Grace suddenly stiffened beside him. No, she whispered, so quietly he almost didn't hear it. Frederick glanced at her, finding her staring intently at the empty space beside her, her lips pressed into a tight line. Miss Thomas, he asked, slowing the wagon. I'm fine, she said sharply, then immediately softened her tone. I'm sorry, just a headache forming, the sun perhaps. Frederick reached behind the seat and produced a canteen. Water might help. She accepted it gratefully, taking a small sip before handing it back. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and Frederick was struck again by the contrast between her delicate hands and the stubborn set of her jaw. Mr. Xavier, she said after another stretch of silence. About what you saw in Silver Pine. It's not my business, he interrupted. No, it isn't, she agreed, but you've been kind enough not to mention it, and I appreciate that more than you know. Frederick kept his eyes on the trail. Everyone's entitled to their privacy out here, Miss Thomas. The frontier strips away enough without neighbors prying into what's left. The journey to Halsted Creek would take most of the day, with a stop for lunch along a creek that cut through the rolling grasslands. As Frederick helped Grace down from the wagon, he noticed her glancing nervously at the surrounding landscape. Something wrong? He asked. No, she said quickly, it's just so open. In Boston, one is never truly alone. Frederick nodded toward a stand of cottonwoods near the creek. We can rest there, should give some shade for our meal. Grace walked slightly ahead of him, her back straight despite the obvious fatigue of travel. As they settled beneath the trees, Frederick unpacked the lunch Mrs. Morgan had prepared: bread, cheese, dried beef, and apples. It's not what you're used to, he said, offering her portion. It looks wonderful, she replied, accepting the food with genuine appreciation, and the setting far surpasses any Boston terroir. They ate in companionable silence, the creek bubbling nearby and birds calling overhead. It was peaceful in a way Frederick rarely allowed himself to notice, always keeping his mind on work or survival rather than the simple beauty of the land. Do you miss it? Grace asked suddenly. You're home in Missouri. Frederick considered the question, surprising himself by answering honestly. Sometimes, not the place so much as the feeling, belonging somewhere. Yes, she said softly, that's precisely it. Something in her tone made Frederick look up. Grace was staring at the creek, her expression distant and tinged with sadness. Is that why you came west? He asked, to find somewhere to belong. She met his gaze, her eyes clear and direct. Partly, and partly to leave behind expectations I could never fulfill. Before he could respond, she stiffened again, her attention fixing on a point just beside her. Frederick followed her gaze but saw nothing except grass moving in the breeze. No, she whispered, her fingers curling into fists in her lap, not now. Frederick set down his food, concern overriding his usual reticence. Miss Thomas, are you? I said not now, she snapped, then immediately covered her mouth with her hand, eyes wide with horror. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. It's all right, Frederick said, though uncertainty clouded his voice. Grace stood abruptly, brushing crumbs from her skirt. Perhaps we should continue our journey, I've kept you long enough. Frederick rose more slowly. watching as she marched back toward the wagon without waiting for his response. There was something both concerning and admirable about the way she gathered her dignity around herself like armor, refusing to crumble despite whatever internal battle she was fighting. As they continued toward Halsted Creek, the terrain gradually changed, the open prairie giving way to scattered pines as they approached the foothills. Grace remained quiet, her posture rigid and her gaze fixed ahead, though occasionally Frederick caught her lips moving in silent conversation with no one. It was early evening when they finally crested the last hill and saw Halsted Creek spread below them, a collection of perhaps 30 buildings nestled in a small valley, with mountains rising in the distance. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the small white church steeple stood prominent against the darkening sky. "It's lovely," Grace breathed, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "It's growing," Frederick replied. "The silver mine to the north brought in enough folks to need a proper school." As they drove down the main street, curious faces peered from windows and doorways. Frederick knew Halsted Creek's new teacher had been eagerly awaited. The town had gone nearly a year with only sporadic schooling provided by the preacher's wife. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of a small white building with a bell mounted on the roof. Next door stood a neat little cottage that Frederick assumed was the teacher's residence. Before he could climb down to help her, a portly man in a black suit hurried from the building that served as the town hall and general store combined. "Miss Thomas," the man called, his face beaming with welcome. "We'd nearly given up hope. I'm Mayor Simmons. Welcome to Halsted Creek." Grace composed herself quickly, offering a polite smile as Frederick helped her down from the wagon. "Thank you, Mayor. I apologize for the delay. There seems to have been some confusion about my transportation arrangements." No matter, you're here now," the mayor turned to Frederick with a nod. "Much obliged, Xavier. William Morgan said he'd send someone reliable." Frederick touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement as more townspeople began to gather, all eager to meet the new schoolteacher. He busied himself unloading Grace's trunk and belongings, carrying them into the small cottage that would be her home. The interior was simple but clean, a main room with a small stove, table and rocking chair, and a curtained alcove that presumably held a bed. Frederick set down her trunk, feeling suddenly awkward in the intimate space. When he stepped back outside, he found Grace surrounded by townswomen, all talking at once about the school, the children, and various community matters. She appeared perfectly composed, answering questions with poise and gentle humor, though Frederick noticed the slight tension around her eyes. He should leave. His task was complete, and he had horses to deliver to the Johnson ranch the next morning. Yet something kept him rooted to the spot, watching as Grace navigated her introduction to Halsted Creek with grace befitting her name. As if sensing his gaze, she looked up, their eyes meeting over the heads of chattering women. For a moment something like panic flashed across her features, followed by a silent plea he couldn't quite interpret. Mayor Simmons clapped his hands together. Ladies, give Miss Thomas some air. She's had a long journey and needs rest before meeting the children tomorrow." The women reluctantly dispersed, each offering final welcomes and promises to bring food or assistance in the morning. As the crowd thinned, Frederick approached the mayor and Grace. "I should head back," he said, hat in hand. "Got business at Johnson's ranch tomorrow." "Nonsense," the mayor exclaimed. "It's nearly dark. You'll stay at the hotel tonight, my treat, as thanks for delivering our teacher safely." Frederick hesitated, looking to Grace, whose expression was carefully neutral. "That's very kind," she said softly, "and perhaps Mr. Xavier could join us for the school's opening tomorrow. The children would benefit from meeting someone who works at one of the territory's largest ranches." Her invitation surprised him, especially given her obvious discomfort earlier in the day. But something in her eyes, a vulnerability beneath the composed exterior, made refusal impossible. "I suppose Johnson can wait another day," Frederick found himself saying. Mayor Simmons beamed. "Excellent, Mrs. Simmons will have my hide if I don't bring you both for supper. She's been cooking all day in anticipation of Miss Thomas's arrival." As they walked toward the mayor's house, Frederick fell into step beside Grace, keeping his voice low. "You don't have to include me in your welcome. I'm sure you're exhausted." Grace glanced up at him, her hazel eyes earnest in the fading light. Actually, I would very much appreciate your presence, Mr. Xavier. You're the only, she paused, searching for words, the only person I know here. Familiar faces are rare commodities on the frontier, are they not? Frederick nodded slowly, understanding the sentiment all too well. In his years of drifting, he'd learned how valuable even brief acquaintances could become in strange surroundings. Then I'm glad to be of service, Miss Thomas. The mayor's home was the largest in town, a two-story structure with actual glass windows and a wraparound porch. Inside, Mrs. Simmons, a round, cheerful woman with graying hair, had prepared a feast that seemed excessive for just 4 people. We don't often get visitors from Boston, she explained, heaping Frederick's plate with more food than he'd eat in 2 days normally. And certainly not educated young ladies. Tell me, Miss Thomas, how do you find our little town so far? Grace answered with perfect politeness, describing the beauty of the landscape and her eagerness to meet her students. Throughout the meal, Frederick noticed how she occasionally glanced at the empty chair beside her, her expression flickering between annoyance and something like grief before she would compose herself again. The conversation flowed easily as the mayor described Halsted Creek's growth and prospects, with Mrs. Simmons interjecting colorful details about various townspeople. Frederick contributed little content to observe and occasionally answer direct questions about the Rocking M's operations. As the evening progressed, he found his attention repeatedly drawn to Grace, to the intelligent light in her eyes when discussing education, to the graceful movement of her hands as she emphasized a point, to the careful way she maintained her composure despite moments of obvious distraction. There was a mystery there, one Frederick had no right to unravel. Yet he couldn't deny his growing curiosity about the woman who spoke to empty chairs and carried herself with such determined dignity. When they finally left the mayor's house, the night had fully descended, stars blazing overhead in the clear Montana sky. Mayor Simmons directed Frederick to the small hotel at the end of the street while personally escorting Grace back to her cottage. "Until tomorrow, Miss Thomas," Frederick said, tipping his hat. Grace paused, turning back to face him. In the lantern light from the mayor's porch, her face held a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. "Thank you, Mr. Xavier," she said softly, "for everything today." As Frederick watched them disappear down the darkened street, he realized with sudden clarity that he'd spoken more words today than he had in the past month combined. Somehow this strange, troubled woman had drawn him out of his carefully maintained silence, and against all his better judgment, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow. Morning arrived with golden light streaming through the hotel's thin curtains. Frederick rose early, as was his habit, washing and dressing with care before heading to check on his horses. The town was already awake, shopkeepers sweeping boardwalks and women hanging laundry in the cool morning air. The schoolhouse bell rang at 8 o'clock, its clear tone echoing through the small valley. Frederick found himself walking toward the sound, drawn by curiosity and a promise made. Children were already gathering in the schoolyard, their faces scrubbed clean and hair slicked down for the important occasion. Parents stood in small clusters, watching as Grace Thomas emerged from her cottage in a crisp blue dress, her chestnut hair neatly arranged beneath a modest hat. She moved with purpose, greeting each child by name as they were introduced, offering warm smiles and gentle questions that immediately set them at ease. Whatever private struggle haunted her seemed absent in the presence of the children, her entire being focused on making them comfortable. Frederick stood at the edge of the yard, hat in hand, feeling oddly out of place among the families. He was considering a quiet departure when Grace spotted him, her face brightening as she beckoned him forward. "Children, this is Mr. Xavier from the Rocking M Ranch," she announced as he reluctantly approached. "He's going to tell us about ranch life before we begin our lessons." 20 pairs of curious eyes fixed on Frederick, who suddenly wished for a stampede to provide escape. He'd never been comfortable as the center of attention, preferring the solitude of fence lines and cattle herds to human scrutiny. "Mr. Xavier," Grace prompted gently when he remained silent, her eyes holding his with unexpected understanding. Frederick cleared his throat. "Well, ranching is hard work," he began awkwardly. "We get up before sunrise and work until dark, tending cattle and horses, fixing fences, and—" he trailed off, seeing the children's attention already wandering. Then a small boy of about 7 piped up, "Have you ever shot a bear?" The simple question broke the tension. Frederick found himself smiling slightly. No, but I've chased off a few that were after calves. This sparked a flurry of questions from the children about wolves, outlaws, cattle drives, and whether he'd ever been in a gunfight. With each answer, Frederick felt his discomfort easing, especially when he caught Grace watching him with approval in her hazel eyes. After about 15 minutes, she clapped her hands. "Thank you, Mr. Xavier. Children, it's time to go inside for our first lesson. What do we say to our guest?" "Thank you, Mr. Xavier," came the chorus of young voices. As the children filed into the schoolhouse, Grace lingered behind. "You were wonderful with them," she said, genuine warmth in her voice. Frederick shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know about that." "I do," she replied firmly. "Children can sense sincerity, and you didn't talk down to them." She glanced toward the school door, then back to him. "Will you still be in town when school lets out?" I thought perhaps we might continue our conversation from yesterday." The request surprised him, especially given her obvious discomfort during parts of their journey. "I should be heading to Johnson's today," he said, though without conviction. Disappointment flickered across her features, though she quickly masked it. "Of course, you have responsibilities. But I suppose another day won't matter much," he found himself adding. "Johnson's not expecting me on any particular day." Her smile was worth the change in plans. "Wonderful, the children will be dismissed at 3 o'clock." As Grace turned to enter the schoolhouse, Frederick noticed her pause, her head tilting slightly as though listening to someone beside her. Her lips moved in what appeared to be a silent "not now," before she straightened her shoulders and continued inside. Frederick spent the day exploring Halsted Creek, a town he'd visited only briefly in the past. It was growing faster than most frontier settlements, the silver mine providing steady income and attracting merchants who might otherwise avoid such remote locations. By mid-afternoon, he found himself back at the schoolhouse, leaning against a pine tree as he waited for the final bell. When it rang, children spilled from the building with the boundless energy of youth finally unleashed, scattering toward homes and play areas throughout town. Grace appeared in the doorway, watching them go with a satisfied expression that transformed to pleasure when she spotted Frederick waiting. "You came back," she said as she approached, untying her apron and draping it over her arm. "Said I would," he replied simply. They walked together toward her cottage, Grace sharing anecdotes about her first day of teaching. Her animation when discussing the children was captivating, her hands gesturing expressively, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "Would you care for tea?" she asked as they reached her door. "It's not much, but—" "Tea would be fine," Frederick interrupted, though he rarely drank anything but coffee. The inside of the cottage looked different in daylight, homier, with Grace's books arranged on a small shelf and a vase of wildflowers on the table. She moved about the small space with practiced efficiency, setting water to boil and arranging cups on a tray. Frederick stood awkwardly until she gestured toward a chair. "Please sit. I'm afraid it's not very comfortable, but it's sturdy at least." He lowered himself into the chair, placing his hat on his knee as Grace prepared the tea. There was something intimate about watching her domestic movements, something that made him acutely aware of how long it had been since he'd been inside a woman's home. "How long will you stay in Halsted Creek?" she asked, bringing the tea to the table. "Just until tomorrow," he replied, accepting the cup she offered. "Got horses to deliver and then back to the Rocking M." Grace nodded, taking the seat across from him. "It's fortunate our paths crossed when they did. I'm not sure how long I might have waited in Silverpine otherwise." "Seems strange nobody came for you," Frederick observed. "Town's been waiting months for a teacher." A shadow passed over her face. "There was some confusion with the dates in my correspondence with the town council. My fault, I'm certain." Frederick sipped his tea, finding it surprisingly pleasant despite his usual preference for stronger drinks. "Will your family be joining you later?" he asked, immediately regretting the question when grief flickered across her features. "I have no family," she said quietly, "not anymore." The simple statement hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken history. Frederick recognized the tone, he'd heard it in his own voice often enough. "I'm sorry," he said, meaning it. Grace's smile was sad but genuine. "Thank you, it's been difficult, but teaching gives me purpose." These children need education if they're to have opportunities beyond what the frontier currently offers. Noble goal, Frederick said, studying her over the rim of his teacup. Most folks out here are just trying to survive. Survival isn't enough, she replied with surprising firmness. We must build something worth surviving for. The conviction in her voice struck something deep within Frederick, a chord he'd thought long silenced. For years he'd focused solely on enduring, moving from job to job, place to place, never allowing himself to imagine a future beyond the next season. Their conversation drifted to lighter topics, books they'd read, places they'd seen, the characters of Halsted Creek that Grace had already identified. Throughout, Frederick noticed how she occasionally glanced to her left, at times frowning slightly as though irritated by an interruption only she could hear. Eventually, the lengthening shadows reminded Frederick of the hour. I should go, he said, rising from his chair. Early start tomorrow. Grace stood as well, smoothing her skirts. Of course, thank you for your company, Mr. Xavier. It's made my first day here much less solitary. Frederick, he said impulsively, or Fred if you prefer. Mr. Xavier makes me look for my father. Her smile brightened. Frederick then, and I'm Grace to my friends. Are we friends, Miss Thomas? He asked, surprised by his own boldness. I believe we could be, she replied, her eyes holding his with unexpected directness, if you're willing. Frederick placed his hat on his head, buying time to steady his inexplicable nervousness. I don't make friends easily, he admitted. Neither do I, Grace said softly. Then, with a glance to her left, she added more quietly, not real ones anyway. Before Frederick could respond to this puzzling statement, a knock at the door interrupted them. Grace opened it to find Mayor Simmons standing on her porch, beaming widely. Miss Thomas, the town council would like to formally welcome you with dinner at the hotel restaurant. The whole town's turning out. His gaze shifted to Frederick. Xavier, you're welcome too, of course. Any friend of our new teacher is welcome in Halsted Creek. Grace looked momentarily overwhelmed but composed herself quickly. That's very kind, Mayor. What time should I arrive? 6 o'clock sharp, the mayor declared. Don't you worry about a thing. This town's been waiting too long for a proper teacher not to celebrate. After the mayor departed, Grace turned to Frederick with a hint of anxiety in her expression. Will you come? I know you plan to leave tomorrow, but… I'll be there, Frederick said, surprised again by his own willingness to alter his carefully structured routine. Relief washed over her features. Thank you. I find these social gatherings rather challenging at times. Frederick nodded, understanding perfectly the discomfort of forced socialization. 6 o'clock then. As he left the cottage, he found himself glancing back to see Grace standing in the doorway, watching him go. Something about her, her strength masked by gentility, her intelligence tempered with kindness, had gotten under his skin in a way he hadn't experienced in years. And he still had no idea why she talked to empty chairs. The hotel's small restaurant had been transformed for the evening's celebration. Tables were pushed together to form one long dining surface, covered with the establishment's best linens and adorned with wildflowers in glass jars. Nearly everyone in Halsted Creek had turned out, dressed in their Sunday best despite it being a Wednesday. Frederick arrived precisely at 6, wearing the one good shirt he carried in his saddlebags and his least-worn pair of trousers. He'd even taken the time to shave properly, a fact that earned him a knowing smile from the hotel proprietor. Grace arrived moments later, escorted by the mayor's wife. She wore a dress of deep burgundy that Frederick hadn't seen before, her chestnut hair arranged more elaborately than during the day. The effect was striking, transforming her from pretty schoolteacher to genuine beauty. Throughout the meal, Frederick observed how skillfully Grace navigated the attention. She answered questions about Boston with just enough detail to satisfy curiosity without revealing much about herself. She deflected personal inquiries with gentle humor and redirected conversation to topics of community interest. It was a masterful performance, one that suggested considerable practice in social situations. Yet Frederick noticed the moments when her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, or when her gaze drifted to empty spaces beside various guests, her expression briefly clouding before she forced her attention back to the conversation at hand. He was seated several places away from her, between the blacksmith and the general store owner, but even from this distance, he could see the strain beneath her composure growing as the evening progressed. When the mayor rose to make a toast, Frederick watched Grace's hand tighten around her water glass, her knuckles whitening as the man launched into a lengthy speech about education and civilization on the frontier. And so, the mayor concluded at last, "We welcome Miss Grace Thomas to Halsted Creek and trust she will guide our children toward a brighter future." Cheers erupted around the table, glasses raised in salute. Grace acknowledged the toast with a gracious nod, but as the noise continued, Frederick saw something change in her expression, a flash of panic, quickly suppressed. She rose suddenly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Excuse me," she murmured, "just need a moment of fresh air." Frederick watched as she made her way through the crowded room toward the hotel's rear door that opened onto a small porch. Without consciously deciding to, he found himself following, concerned by the distress he'd glimpsed in her eyes. Outside, the night air was cool and clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the vast Montana sky. Grace stood at the porch railing, her back to the door, her shoulders rigid with tension. "Stop it," she was whispering fiercely. "You're not real, you can't be real." Frederick hesitated, unsure whether to make his presence known or retreat. Before he could decide, Grace continued, her voice breaking. "Please, just leave me alone. I'm trying to start over. I'm trying to be normal." "Miss Thomas," Frederick said quietly, unable to watch her distress any longer. Grace whirled around, her face pale in the moonlight, eyes wide with mortification. "Frederick, I didn't. How long have you?" "Just got here," he lied, stepping forward. "Thought you might need a friend." Tears welled in her eyes, though she blinked them back with fierce determination. "I'm fine, just needed air, all those people." "It's overwhelming," Frederick agreed, moving to stand beside her at the railing, careful to leave proper distance between them. "Not used to crowds myself." They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the celebration muted behind the closed door. Frederick waited, sensing she needed the quiet to collect herself. "You must think I'm mad," Grace finally said, her voice barely audible. Frederick considered his words carefully. "I think you're carrying something heavy, don't know what it is, but I know what that looks like." She turned to face him, searching his expression for judgment and finding none. "Everyone has ghosts, Frederick, mine are just more persistent than most." The metaphor struck him as apt, though he suspected she meant it more literally than most would. "Ghosts don't scare me," he said simply. A sad smile touched her lips. "They should, they're relentless." Before he could respond, the door opened behind them, spilling light and noise onto the porch. Mrs. Simmons peered out, her round face concerned. "There you are, dear. Are you feeling unwell? The mayor's about to bring out the cake and everyone's asking for you." Grace straightened, her composure returning with remarkable speed. "Just getting some air, Mrs. Simmons. I'll be right in." As the older woman retreated, Grace turned to Frederick, gratitude evident in her eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For not asking questions I can't answer." With that, she squared her shoulders and returned to the celebration, leaving Frederick alone with the night and a growing sense that Grace Thomas was far more complex and troubled than he'd initially believed. The next morning dawned clear and cool, with the promise of autumn in the air. Frederick prepared to leave Halsted Creek, loading his few belongings onto his horse and settling his bill at the hotel. The horses he was to deliver to Johnson's ranch were already saddled and tethered, ready for the journey. He should feel relief at returning to the familiar routine of ranch work, to the solitude he normally craved. Instead, he found himself hesitating, glancing repeatedly toward the small white schoolhouse where Grace was undoubtedly already teaching her second day of classes. "Heading out, Xavier." Called the blacksmith from his shop across the street, Frederick nodded, adjusting his saddle. "Got business at Johnson's." "Shame you can't stay longer," the man replied with a knowing grin. "Miss Thomas seemed to enjoy your company last night." Frederick ignored the comment, checking the lead ropes on the horses he was delivering. He'd spent too long in Halsted Creek already, allowed himself to become too curious about a woman whose problems were none of his concern. Yet as he mounted his horse, he found himself guiding it toward the schoolhouse rather than the trail out of town. Just to say goodbye, he told himself, common courtesy. The sound of children reciting multiplication tables drifted through the schoolhouse windows as Frederick approached. He dismounted, tethering his horses to a nearby post, and removed his hat as he neared the open door. Inside, Grace stood before a blackboard, pointer in hand, as 20 children repeated after her in sing-song voices. She wore a simple gray dress today, practical for teaching, yet somehow it enhanced rather than diminished her beauty. Her hair was pulled back in a practical bun, though a few strands had already escaped to frame her face. She spotted him in the doorway, surprise and pleasure brightening her features. "Children, continue practicing your sevens while I speak with our visitor," she instructed, setting down her pointer and moving to the door. "You're leaving," she said as she stepped outside, not a question but a statement of fact. Frederick nodded, turning his hat in his hands. "Got to deliver those horses, then back to the rocking M." "Of course," Grace replied, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "You've been very kind to delay your journey this long already." Frederick searched for appropriate words, finding none that seemed adequate. "I wanted to say goodbye and to wish you well with the school." "Thank you," she said softly. "The children are wonderful. I think I'll be very happy here." A silence stretched between them, filled with unasked questions and unspoken concerns. Frederick found himself reluctant to end the conversation, though he had no reason to prolong it. "If you're ever near the rocking M," he heard himself saying, "you'd be welcome to visit." Grace's smile warmed. "That's very kind, perhaps during the school holiday." Frederick nodded, settling his hat back on his head. "Well, goodbye then, Miss Thomas." "Goodbye, Frederick," she replied, her voice carrying a hint of regret that echoed his own unexpected feelings. "And thank you again for everything." As he rode out of Halsted Creek, leading the horses for the Johnson Ranch, Frederick told himself the heaviness in his chest was simply the result of too much socializing after years of solitude. He'd be back to normal once he returned to the familiar rhythm of ranch work, to the predictable company of cowboys and cattle. Grace Thomas and her ghosts would fade from memory, becoming just another brief encounter in a life marked by transient connections. But as the miles stretched between them, he found himself glancing back toward Halsted Creek more often than the trail ahead, the image of her face staying with him long after the town had disappeared from view. 2 months passed, autumn giving way to the first chill of winter. Frederick threw himself into ranch work with renewed determination, volunteering for the most isolated tasks: fence repair in distant pastures, overnight watches during cattle drives, hunting expeditions for the ranch's winter meat supply. The other hands noticed his increased solitude but asked no questions. On the frontier, a man's mood was his own business unless it interfered with work, and Frederick's diligence was beyond reproach. Yet despite his efforts, thoughts of Grace Thomas continued to intrude on his carefully maintained isolation. He found himself wondering how she was faring in Halsted Creek, whether the townspeople had accepted her despite her odd behavior, whether she still spoke to empty chairs when no one was watching. It was during one such distracted moment, while repairing a broken wagon wheel, that William Morgan approached him, the ranch owner's heavy boots crunching on the frozen ground. "Xavier," Morgan called, his breath visible in the cold November air, "needs you to make a run to Halsted Creek." Frederick's hands stilled on the wheel. "Halsted Creek." Morgan nodded, pulling his coat tighter against the wind. "Got a package needs delivering to the bank there. Sensitive documents, can't trust it to just anyone." "Johnson's closer," Frederick said, resuming his work on the wheel. "Or Peterson could go." "Johnson's laid up with that broken leg, and Peterson can't be trusted with anything more valuable than horse feed," Morgan replied bluntly. "Besides, thought you might want to check on that schoolteacher you escorted. Mrs. Morgan's been wondering how she's settling in." Frederick kept his expression neutral despite the sudden quickening of his pulse. "When do I leave?" "Tomorrow at first light," Morgan said. "Should be back before the storm hits end of the week." That night Frederick found sleep elusive, his mind filled with anticipation and uncertainty. He told himself his restlessness was simply due to the sudden change in routine, nothing more. Yet he couldn't deny the lift in his spirits at the prospect of seeing Grace again. The journey to Halsted Creek took most of the day, the trail made slower by patches of early snow and frozen ground. Frederick rode with purpose, the sealed package secure in his saddlebags, his thoughts alternating between practical concerns about the weather and less practical wonderings about how Grace might receive his unexpected return. Halsted Creek came into view as afternoon shadows lengthened across the valley. The town looked different in winter's approach, smoke rising from every chimney, windows glowing with lamplight against the early dusk, the surrounding hills dusted with snow. Frederick delivered the package to the bank first, completing his official business efficiently. Then, rather than heading directly to the hotel, he found himself walking toward the schoolhouse, drawn by the warm light spilling from its windows into the gathering gloom. School hours would be over, but perhaps Grace was still there, preparing lessons or grading papers. He approached quietly, not wanting to startle her if she was working. The schoolhouse door stood slightly ajar, allowing a sliver of light to escape into the cold evening. As Frederick neared, he heard Grace's voice from within, not the instructional tone he'd heard her use with students, but something softer, more intimate. "I know you miss me," she was saying, her voice tinged with sadness. "I miss you too, every day." Frederick hesitated, realizing she was engaged in one of her one-sided conversations. He should leave, give her privacy for whatever strange communion she practiced, yet concern kept him rooted to the spot, especially as her voice continued, breaking slightly. "But you have to understand, I can't live in both worlds. I'm trying to build something here, real connections with real people." A pause, as though listening to a response Frederick couldn't hear. "No," she said firmly, "you're not real. Dr. Hoffman explained it all. You're just my mind's way of coping with loss. I have to let you go if I'm ever going to heal." The pain in her voice compelled Frederick forward. He knocked gently on the door frame, not wanting to eavesdrop further. The sound of a chair scraping across wooden floorboards was followed by footsteps. The door opened wider, revealing Grace with surprise written across her features. "Frederick," she exclaimed, one hand flying to her throat. "What are you doing here?" In the lamplight, she looked both familiar and changed. Her chestnut hair was arranged in the same practical style, but her face seemed thinner, the shadows beneath her eyes more pronounced. She wore a simple blue dress with a woolen shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the classroom's chill. "Delivering papers for Morgan," he explained, suddenly aware of how his unexpected appearance might seem. "Thought I'd see how you were faring before checking into the hotel." Grace's expression shifted from surprise to genuine pleasure. "That's very kind. Please come in out of the cold." The schoolroom was neat and orderly, with alphabet charts on the walls and children's arithmetic exercises displayed on a bulletin board. A pot-bellied stove in the corner provided warmth, though the fire had burned low. "Let me add more wood," Grace said, moving to the stove. "It gets so cold once the sun sets." Frederick closed the door against the evening chill, noticing a tea service set for one on her desk, and a second cup placed opposite, as though for a companion. Grace followed his gaze, her cheeks coloring slightly as she busied herself with the stove. "How long will you be in town?" she asked, clearly changing the subject. "Just tonight," Frederick replied, removing his hat. "Heading back tomorrow before the storm hits." "They're saying it might be the first big snow of the season," Grace said, returning to her desk and discreetly moving the second teacup to a shelf. "The children are hoping for enough to cancel school." "And their teacher?" Frederick asked, a small smile touching his lips. Grace's answering smile was warm. "Their teacher remembers snowball fights from her own childhood and wouldn't mind a day to participate in one." The easy rapport between them surprised Frederick. Despite the months apart, conversation flowed naturally, as though they'd known each other far longer than their brief acquaintance warranted. "How are you finding Halsted Creek?" he asked, genuinely wanting to know. "Town treating you well?" Grace gestured for him to take a seat in one of the student desks as she returned to her chair. "Very well, actually. The children are eager to learn, and the parents have been supportive. I've started an evening class for adults who never had proper schooling." "Ambitious," Frederick commented, impressed despite himself. "Necessary," she corrected gently. "Education shouldn't end with childhood." As they talked, Frederick noticed how Grace occasionally glanced at the empty space beside her desk, her expression flickering with emotions he couldn't decipher: annoyance, sadness, resignation. Yet unlike during their journey to Halsted Creek, she seemed better able to maintain her focus on their conversation. "And the rocking M?" she asked. "Has it been a good autumn for the ranch?" "Profitable enough," Frederick replied. "Cattle prices are holding steady, and we didn't lose many to wolves this year." "I'm glad," Grace said, her gaze direct and interested. "The children have been asking about ranch life ever since your visit. Particularly little Thomas Johnson. He's determined to be a cowboy when he grows up." "His father owns good land," Frederick said. "Boy could do worse than following the family business." Their conversation continued as darkness settled fully outside, covering topics from books they'd recently read to the town's preparations for winter. Throughout, Frederick found himself studying Grace, noting the changes since their last meeting, not just the physical signs of strain, but a new determination in her manner, as though she'd been fighting a private battle and slowly gaining ground. When the schoolhouse clock struck 7, Grace started, surprised by the hour. "Goodness, I've kept you too long. You must be hungry after your journey." "I am," Frederick admitted, rising from the desk that was too small for his frame. "Hotel should have something warm." "Actually," Grace said, a hint of uncertainty entering her voice, "I made a stew this morning before school. It's been simmering all day, and there's certainly enough for two. If you'd care to join me." The invitation caught Frederick off guard. Dining alone with an unmarried woman in her home wasn't strictly proper, even on the frontier where social rules were often relaxed by necessity. Grace seemed to read his hesitation. "I understand if you'd prefer the hotel. I just thought, well, it would be nice to continue our conversation." There was something in her expression, a mixture of hope and vulnerability, that made refusal impossible. "Stew sounds better than whatever the hotel's serving," he said. Relief and pleasure brightened her features. "Wonderful, my cottage is just next door, as you know." They walked the short distance between buildings, their breath visible in the cold night air. Stars glittered overhead in the clear sky, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a reminder of the wilderness that surrounded their small pocket of civilization. Grace's cottage was warm and welcoming, the stew's aroma filling the small space. She moved about with quiet efficiency, setting the table and ladling the thick mixture of beef, potatoes, and vegetables into bowls while Frederick hung his coat and hat on a peg by the door. "It's not fancy," she said as they sat down to eat, "but it should be hearty." "Fancy doesn't fill the stomach," Frederick replied, taking a spoonful. The stew was rich and flavorful, better than anything served at the ranch's cookhouse. "This is good." Grace smiled, pleased by the simple compliment. "Thank you, I'm still learning to cook with limited ingredients. Boston markets offered more variety than the general store here." As they ate, Frederick noticed small changes in the cottage since his last visit. Curtains now hung at the windows, a colorful quilt draped over the rocking chair, and a shelf of books had expanded to include what appeared to be student compositions bound with twine. "You've made it home," he observed. Grace glanced around the small space, her expression softening. "I'm trying to. It helps to surround oneself with things that bring comfort." They ate in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the clink of spoons against bowls and the occasional pop from the stove as it heated the room. "May I ask you something, Frederick?" Grace said suddenly, setting down her spoon. He nodded, curious at her serious tone. "Why did you follow me that night at the welcome dinner when I went outside?" "You said you just arrived, but," she met his gaze directly, "you heard me talking to no one, didn't you?" Frederick considered denying it, then decided against dishonesty. "I did." "And yet you're here, eating stew in my home, not running for the hills or suggesting I belong in an asylum." Her voice held wonder rather than accusation. "Not my place to judge," Frederick said simply. "We all have our ways of coping with what life throws at us." Grace studied him for a long moment, as though seeing him truly for the first time. Most people wouldn't be so understanding. Frederick shrugged, uncomfortable with her scrutiny. "Most people talk too much and think too little." A small smile touched her lips, a succinct assessment of human nature. They finished their meal and Grace made tea, the familiar ritual now comfortable between them. As they sat before the stove, warming themselves against the deepening chill outside, Frederick found himself more relaxed than he'd been in months. "Do you ever get lonely, Frederick?" Grace asked quietly, her eyes on the flames visible through the stove's small window. Out there on the ranch, I mean. The question penetrated defenses Frederick hadn't realized he'd constructed. Sometimes, he admitted, surprising himself with his honesty, though I usually prefer my own company. As do I, Grace said, or at least I used to think I did. She hesitated, turning her teacup in her hands. The truth is, I've never really been alone, not since. She trailed off, her gaze drifting to the empty rocking chair beside them. Frederick followed her look, seeing nothing but understanding everything at once. Who do you see? He asked gently, breaking his promise not to question her strange behavior. Grace's eyes snapped back to his, widened with surprise at the direct inquiry. For a moment he thought she might refuse to answer or ask him to leave. Instead, she set down her teacup with trembling hands. "My sister," she whispered. "Emily, she died 3 years ago of scarlet fever. We were twins." The simple explanation illuminated so much, the one-sided conversations, the distress when others nearly noticed, the desperate assertion that her visions weren't real. "I'm sorry," Frederick said, meaning it deeply. Grace nodded, blinking back tears. The doctors called it a grief hallucination at first, then when it didn't stop, they suggested more serious diagnoses. My father sent me to specialists in Boston and New York. They had treatments. The way she said the word made Frederick's jaw tighten, imagining what those treatments might have entailed. None of it worked, she continued, her voice strengthening. Emily remained. Sometimes just watching, sometimes talking to me. After my father died last year, I decided I needed a fresh start, somewhere far from Boston where no one knew about my condition. And you chose Montana, Frederick said, understanding dawning. I chose teaching first, Grace corrected. Montana chose me. There were several positions advertised for frontier schoolteachers. Halsted Creek offered the most remote location and the most desperate need. Frederick considered her story, impressed by her courage. Must have been a difficult journey, especially alone. A sad smile touched Grace's lips. That's just it, I've never been truly alone. Emily comes with me everywhere, sometimes I wish. She stopped, looking again at the empty rocking chair. Sometimes I wish she would find peace and leave me to find mine. That's what the doctors said I needed to tell her. Does it help telling her to go? Grace shook her head, a tear finally escaping to track down her cheek. She only leaves when she wants to, usually when I'm with other people, real people, for extended periods. It's why I was so grateful for your company when I first arrived. When I'm connecting with the living, she fades somewhat. The implication struck Frederick deeply, that his presence had provided her some measure of relief from her haunting. It explained her invitation to dinner, her apparent pleasure at his unexpected return. Is she here now? He asked quietly. Grace glanced toward the rocking chair, then back to Frederick. Not at this moment, she doesn't care for you very much. Despite the seriousness of their conversation, Frederick found himself smiling slightly. Can't say I've had a ghost take a dislike to me before. His mild humor seemed to ease some of the tension from Grace's shoulders. She thinks I talk to you too much. That I'm trying to replace her. Are you? The blunt question hung between them, weighted with implications neither was ready to address directly. I'm trying to live, Grace said finally. Really live, not just exist alongside a memory. She set down her empty teacup, her expression determined despite the tear tracks on her cheeks. That's why I came west. To build a life among people who need me, children who need education, a town that needs culture and refinement. To be more than just the crazy twin who survived. Frederick found himself moved by her honesty, by the strength evident beneath her delicate exterior. Without thinking, he reached across the small table and covered her hand with his own. You're succeeding, he said simply. Grace looked down at their joined hands, surprise giving way to something warmer in her expression. Some days I believe that, she whispered. Other days when I find myself arguing with empty air. We all fight our ghosts, Frederick said. Some are just more visible than others. Her fingers turned beneath his, twining them together in a grip that felt like both gratitude and connection. Thank you for not thinking I'm mad. If you're mad, it's a madness I understand, he replied, the words coming from some deeper place than he usually allowed himself to access. We all carry those we've lost. They sat in silence for a long moment, hands joined, the crackling of the stove and the distant howl of wind the only sounds. Frederick was acutely aware of the impropriety of their position, yet equally aware that something important was happening between them, something more meaningful than frontier propriety. Eventually, Grace withdrew her hand, though reluctantly. "It's getting late and you have an early journey tomorrow." Frederick nodded, rising from his chair. "Thank you for the meal. And the conversation." "Will you," Grace hesitated, then continued with quiet courage, "will you come back to Halsted Creek sometime when you're not on ranch business?" The question held more than a simple invitation. It offered a door to something Frederick had convinced himself he neither wanted nor deserved: connection, understanding, possibly more. "I'd like that," he said, surprising himself with his certainty. Grace walked him to the door, her expression lighter than it had been earlier, despite the difficult revelations between them. "Be safe on your journey tomorrow," she said as he donned his coat and hat. "They say the storm might come early." "I'll outride it," he assured her, pausing at the threshold. "Take care of yourself, Grace." "And your students." "I will," she promised. Then with a small smile, "Emily says to tell you the North Trail is safer this time of year." Frederick raised an eyebrow. "Does she now?" "She may not like you much, but she doesn't wish you frozen in a blizzard," Grace replied, a hint of mischief in her eyes despite the strangeness of the message. "I'll keep it in mind," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Good night, Grace." "Good night, Frederick." As he walked through the cold night toward the hotel, Frederick felt oddly lighter despite the heavy confidences they'd shared. Grace's revelation should have confirmed his worst suspicions about her mental state. Instead, it had only deepened his admiration for her courage and resilience. And somewhere between her cottage and the hotel, Frederick Xavier realized he was falling in love with a woman who saw ghosts. The promised storm arrived earlier than predicted, descending on the region with furious intensity the very next morning. Frederick awoke to howling winds and swirling snow outside his hotel window, the world transformed into a white blur that obscured buildings mere yards away. "Can't head out in that," the hotel proprietor informed him over breakfast. "Not unless you're aiming to become a permanent fixture in some snowdrift." Frederick knew the man was right. Even taking the North Trail, as Grace, or her spectral sister, had suggested, would be foolhardy in such conditions. He resigned himself to remaining in Halsted Creek until the storm passed, sending word to the Rocking M via the telegraph office before it too closed against the weather. With time unexpectedly on his hands, Frederick found himself drawn once again to the schoolhouse. The blizzard had naturally resulted in classes being canceled, but he wondered if Grace might be there nonetheless, perhaps working on lessons or simply seeking the comfort of her classroom. He made his way carefully through snow already knee-deep in places, the wind cutting through his heavy coat as though it were made of paper. The schoolhouse windows were dark when he arrived, but a thin trail of smoke rose from the chimney of Grace's cottage next door. Frederick hesitated before approaching her home. Their conversation the previous evening had crossed boundaries normally maintained between unmarried men and women on the frontier. To call on her again without the pretext of official business would suggest intentions he wasn't sure he was ready to declare. Yet before he could decide, the cottage door opened and Grace appeared, wrapped in a heavy shawl, a look of concern on her face as she peered into the storm. "Frederick," she called when she spotted him, "what are you doing out in this weather? Come inside before you freeze." Decision made for him, Frederick trudged through the snow to her door, stamping his boots on the porch to remove the worst of the accumulation. "Thought you might be at the school," he explained as she ushered him inside. Grace closed the door against the howling wind, her expression a mixture of concern and pleasure. "On a day like this, even the most dedicated teacher knows when to admit defeat to nature." She took his coat, hanging it near the stove to dry. "You weren't trying to leave town, I hope." "No," Frederick replied, removing his hat. "Hotel owner convinced me that would be a fool's errand. Sent word to the ranch I'm delayed." Relief softened her features. "Good, they're saying this storm might last 2 days or more." The implications of that statement hung between them, 2 days or more in Halsted Creek, with no ranch business to attend to and nowhere to go in the blizzard except the hotel, the saloon, or here. I hope I'm not intruding, Frederick said, suddenly aware of the presumption in his visit. Not at all, Grace assured him, moving to the stove where a pot of coffee simmered. I was just about to have coffee and read for a while. Would you care to join me? The simple invitation carried echoes of the previous evening's deeper connection. Frederick found himself nodding before he'd consciously decided. That would be nice, he said, accepting the cup she offered. They settled into what felt like a natural continuation of their conversation from the night before, though today they stayed on safer topics: books they'd enjoyed, places they'd seen, the peculiarities of Halsted Creek's residents. Frederick found himself talking more than he had in years, drawn out by Grace's genuine interest and thoughtful responses. Throughout their conversation, he noticed how her gaze occasionally drifted to empty spaces around the room, though she made no comment about her spectral companion. If Emily was present, she remained unacknowledged, a tacit agreement between Grace and Frederick to focus on the living rather than the dead. As morning gave way to afternoon, the storm's fury increased, rattling the windows and sending drafts through the small cottage despite the blazing stove. When Grace shivered, Frederick rose without thinking to retrieve a quilt from the rocking chair, draping it around her shoulders. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes meeting his with warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibilities neither had yet voiced. Frederick stepped back, returning to his seat with a nod. "Storm's getting worse," he observed, glancing toward the window now frosted with ice and snow. "The children will be delighted," Grace replied, adjusting the quilt around her shoulders. "They've been praying for enough snow to build forts and wage proper snowball wars." "And their teacher?" Frederick asked, echoing his question from the previous evening. Grace's smile held a hint of mischief. "Their teacher is looking forward to demonstrating her superior snowball crafting techniques, honed through years of Boston winters." Frederick found himself chuckling, a rare sound he barely recognized as his own. "Might have to challenge you to a match once this blizzard settles. Montana cowboys know a thing or two about snow warfare." "A formal challenge I accept, sir," Grace declared with mock seriousness, her eyes dancing with playfulness he hadn't seen in her before. Their banter continued through the afternoon, interspersed with quieter moments of companionable silence as they read from Grace's collection of books or simply watched the storm through frost-edged windows. When hunger eventually asserted itself, they worked together to prepare a simple meal from Grace's provisions, moving about the small kitchen space with an ease that felt strangely domestic. As evening approached, however, Frederick became increasingly aware of the impropriety of his extended visit. Frontier society might be more forgiving than Eastern standards, but a bachelor spending an entire day alone with an unmarried woman would raise eyebrows even in Halsted Creek. "I should get back to the hotel before dark," he said reluctantly as they finished washing the dishes from their meal. "Storm or no storm." Grace nodded, though disappointment flickered across her features. "Of course. It wouldn't do to have you snowbound here overnight." The thought hung between them, laden with implications neither was prepared to address. Frederick dried his hands on a kitchen towel, reaching for his coat which had long since dried by the stove. "Thank you for the company," he said, donning the garment, made being stranded much more pleasant. "The pleasure was mine," Grace replied, her smile genuine despite the regret in her eyes. "Perhaps. Perhaps tomorrow, if the storm continues, you might come back. I have plenty of books to share." Frederick found himself nodding, already anticipating seeing her again despite the voice of caution in his mind. "I'd like that." She walked him to the door, where they paused awkwardly, neither quite knowing how to end this day that had shifted something fundamental between them. "Be careful walking back," Grace said finally. "The drifts will be deeper now." "I will," Frederick promised, settling his hat on his head. On impulse, he reached for her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Good night, Grace." Her fingers tightened around his briefly. "Good night, Frederick." The storm raged for 3 days, transforming Halsted Creek into a snowbound island isolated from the surrounding territory. During that time, a pattern emerged between Frederick and Grace. Mornings spent apart as she prepared lessons for when school resumed, and he assisted various townspeople with storm-related tasks, afternoons and early evenings together in her cottage, sharing meals, books, and increasingly personal conversations. With each passing day, Frederick felt walls within himself crumbling, walls built over years of loss and self-protection, reinforced by the harsh realities of frontier life. Grace's presence, her quiet strength and unexpected vulnerability, challenged everything he'd come to believe about the impossibility of real connection. By the third evening, as they sat before her stove reading aloud from a volume of Tennyson's poetry, Frederick realized with startling clarity that he didn't want to leave Halsted Creek, or Grace, when the trails finally cleared. "You're quiet," Grace observed, setting down the book. "Is the poetry not to your liking?" Frederick looked up from the flames he'd been staring into, just thinking. "About," she prompted gently. "The future," he admitted. "What happens when the storm ends?" Understanding dawned in Grace's eyes. "You'll return to the Rocking M and I'll continue teaching here." "And then?" Frederick asked, the question encompassing far more than their immediate plans. Grace's gaze dropped to her hands folded in her lap. "I don't know," she said softly. "I haven't allowed myself to think beyond the present since coming west." "Because of Emily?" Frederick ventured, the name of her spectral twin no longer taboo between them, though Grace rarely mentioned her directly. A sad smile touched Grace's lips. "Partly, it's difficult to build a future when you're haunted by the past." She looked up, meeting his eyes with unexpected directness. "But also because I never expected to find someone who would accept me as I am. Ghosts and all." The simple statement hung between them, an acknowledgement of what had been developing over these snowbound days. "Grace," Frederick began, then paused, gathering courage for words he'd never expected to speak. "I've spent years believing the frontier was no place for attachments, that caring for someone was a weakness that would only lead to pain." "And now," she asked, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "Now I'm not so sure," he admitted. "These past days with you have made me question everything I thought I knew." Grace's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Frederick, I—" A sharp knock at the door interrupted her, startling them both. Frederick rose immediately, instinctively placing himself between Grace and the potential intrusion. "Miss Thomas," came the voice of Mayor Simmons, "are you all right in there? We noticed light and smoke from your chimney, but no one's seen you since yesterday." Grace composed herself quickly, moving to the door and opening it to reveal the mayor bundled against the cold, lantern in hand. "I'm quite well, Mayor Simmons," she assured him, "just catching up on lesson preparations during the unexpected holiday." The mayor's eyes widened as he spotted Frederick standing by the stove. "Xavier, didn't realize you were." "That is—" He cleared his throat, disapproval evident despite his attempt at politeness. "Mr. Xavier was just leaving," Grace said smoothly. "He kindly brought me additional firewood earlier as my supply was running low." Frederick nodded, grabbing his coat and hat. "Mayor," he acknowledged as he moved toward the door. "The storm's finally breaking," Simmons informed them, his tone suggesting he found their situation inappropriate despite Grace's explanation. "Roads should be passable by morning, if you're still planning to return to the Rocking M." "I am," Frederick confirmed, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. An awkward silence descended, broken only when Grace spoke with forced brightness. "Thank you for checking on me, Mayor, and for the update about the weather. I'm sure the children will be disappointed their snow holiday is ending." "Yes, well," the mayor huffed, clearly still suspicious, but unwilling to directly accuse the schoolteacher of impropriety. "School will resume the day after tomorrow, once paths are fully cleared." "I'll be ready," Grace assured him. After another moment of uncomfortable scrutiny, the mayor nodded curtly. "Good evening, then, Miss Thomas." "Xavier." As the door closed behind the mayor, Frederick and Grace stood in silence, the interrupted moment between them now impossible to recapture. The outside world had intruded, bringing with it all the complications and judgments they'd temporarily forgotten in their snowbound seclusion. "I should go," Frederick said finally, though every fiber of his being wanted to stay, to continue the conversation the mayor had interrupted. Grace nodded, her expression a mixture of resignation and unspoken regret. "It would be best." He donned his coat slowly, searching for words to bridge the sudden distance between them. "Grace, what I was saying before." "We can speak tomorrow," she interrupted gently, "before you leave. Once we've both had time to think clearly." Though her words were sensible, Frederick felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter night awaiting him. Tomorrow, then. As he stepped onto the porch, Grace called after him softly. "Frederick." He turned, hope rising despite himself. "Be careful on your way back," she said, her eyes conveying more than her simple words. "I will," he promised, understanding everything she wasn't saying. The walk to the hotel seemed longer than ever, the snow drifts deeper, the cold more biting. Frederick barely noticed the physical discomfort, his mind consumed with the realization that had been building over these days with Grace and the decision he now faced as the trails cleared. Morning arrived clear and blindingly bright, the storm having moved eastward overnight, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white broken only by the tracks of those early risers already venturing out to check damage and clear paths. Frederick rose with the sun, his sleep having been fitful and unproductive. The hotel owner confirmed what the mayor had suggested: the main trails would be passable by midday, allowing Frederick to begin his delayed journey back to the Rocking M. He should have felt relief at the prospect of returning to familiar routine. Instead, he felt only a growing certainty that he was approaching a crossroads far more significant than mere travel plans. After a quick breakfast, Frederick made his way through the snow-laden streets to Grace's cottage, his boots crunching on the freshly fallen snow. Children were already out, their delighted shrieks filling the morning air as they built snowmen and engaged in the promised snowball battles that Grace had anticipated. He found her outside her cottage, clearing a path to her door with a borrowed shovel. She wore a heavy coat and woolen scarf, her cheeks flushed with exertion and cold, her breath visible in the crisp air. At his approach, she looked up, her expression brightening despite the obvious caution in her eyes. "Good morning," she called, leaning on the shovel. "Beautiful day after all that fury, isn't it?" Frederick nodded, glancing at the sparkling landscape. Nature's way of reminding us who's really in charge out here. Grace smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mayor Simmons says the roads will be clear enough for travel by noon." "So I heard," Frederick replied, suddenly uncertain how to broach the subject that had kept him awake most of the night. A somewhat awkward silence fell between them, so different from the easy companionship of their snowbound days. Grace broke it first, gesturing toward her door. "Would you like to come in? I've made coffee." Frederick hesitated, glancing toward the town center where several people were already moving about, including the mayor's wife, who seemed particularly interested in his presence at the schoolteacher's home. "Perhaps we could walk instead," he suggested. "Might be best, given the attention we're attracting." Understanding flickered in Grace's eyes as she followed his gaze. "Of course. Let me just get my gloves." They set out along the main street, now partially cleared of snow, and continued to the edge of town where a small footbridge crossed the creek that gave the settlement its name. In summer, it would be a picturesque spot with wildflowers and willow trees. Now, it was a winter wonderland, the creek partially frozen and the trees laden with snow that sparkled in the morning sunlight. They stopped at the center of the bridge, looking out over the transformed landscape. Frederick removed his hat, turning it in his hands as he gathered his thoughts. "I've been thinking about what happens next," he began, his voice steady despite the uncertainty churning within him. Grace nodded, her gloved hands gripping the bridge railing. "As have I. These past days with you." Frederick paused, searching for words adequate to express the profound shift in his understanding. "They've made me question things I thought I knew for certain." "What things?" Grace asked softly, her eyes on the creek below rather than his face. "That the frontier is no place for attachments, that caring for someone only leads to pain." He took a breath, then continued with hard-won honesty, "that I'm better off alone." Grace turned to him then, her expression open and vulnerable. "And what have you concluded?" "That I was wrong," Frederick said simply, "about all of it." The admission hung between them, momentous in its implications. Grace's eyes widened slightly, hope and fear warring in their hazel depths. "Frederick," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I need to be sure you understand what you're saying, what you'd be taking on if we. I know about Emily," he said gently. "I know your sister is still with you in ways most people wouldn't understand, and I know that might never change." Grace's eyes filled with tears. Most men would run from such madness. Would consider me unstable at best, possessed at worst. I'm not most men, Frederick replied, reaching for her gloved hand, and I don't believe you're mad, just uniquely connected to someone you loved deeply. A tear spilled over, tracking down Grace's cold, flushed cheek. There would be talk, especially after these days we've spent together during the storm. The mayor already suspects. Let them talk, Frederick said with newfound conviction. People always find something to gossip about on the frontier, gives them something to do besides worry about survival. A small smile touched Grace's lips despite her tears. You make it sound so simple. It's not simple, Frederick acknowledged. Nothing worthwhile ever is, but Grace, he paused, making sure he had her full attention. I don't want to ride back to the Rocking M today and pretend these days didn't change everything for me. What are you suggesting? She asked, hope beginning to overtake caution in her expression. Frederick squared his shoulders, finding certainty in the moment of decision. That I stay in Halsted Creek, or at least nearby. Johnson's been looking for a foreman for his ranch, mentioned it when I delivered those horses. It's only 5 miles from town. You'd leave the Rocking M? Grace asked, clearly stunned by his proposition, after 3 years. For the right reason, Frederick replied, his meaning unmistakable. Grace's free hand came up to cover her mouth, her eyes wide with emotion. Frederick, I don't know what to say. Say you'll let me court you properly, he said, the formal phrase feeling strange yet right on his tongue. Say you'll give us a chance to see if what started between us can grow into something permanent. For a long moment, Grace simply stared at him, tears flowing freely now. Then, with a small laugh that sounded like release, she nodded. Yes, she whispered, yes to all of it. Frederick felt something tight and cold within his chest begin to thaw, a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the winter sun overhead. On impulse, he lifted her gloved hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. What about Emily? Grace asked suddenly, her expression sobering. She's not pleased with this development. Frederick glanced at the empty space beside Grace, addressing it directly for the first time. I'm not trying to replace you, he said firmly, but I care for your sister and I want to build a future with her. I hope you can understand that. Grace's eyes widened at his direct address to her spectral twin, then softened with gratitude. After a moment, she smiled slightly. She says she'll try to tolerate you, Grace reported, but makes no promises about not hiding your hat or moving your boots when you're not looking. Frederick found himself smiling at the absurdity and rightness of the moment, standing on a snow-covered bridge, negotiating with a ghost for the right to court the woman he was falling in love with. I can live with that, he said, replacing his hat. Now, I believe I have a conversation to have with Mr. Johnson about a foreman position. As they walked back toward town, hand in gloved hand, Frederick Xavier felt the last of his long-held beliefs about frontier isolation crumbling away. The West might be harsh and unforgiving, but it was also a place where second chances were possible, where new beginnings could emerge from loss, where even ghosts could be accommodated in the building of a future. And as Grace Thomas smiled up at him, her hazel eyes clear and hopeful in the winter sunlight, Frederick knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Halsted Creek, Montana Territory, 1874, 1 year later. The schoolhouse was decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons, the scent of cinnamon and cloves filling the air as children performed their Christmas pageant for the assembled townspeople. At the piano, Grace Thomas, soon to be Grace Xavier, played the final notes of Silent Night as the smallest children took their bows. Applause erupted from the packed room, proud parents and community members expressing their appreciation for the performance that had become a cherished tradition in the year since Grace had established the school's music program. Frederick Xavier stood at the back of the room, his hat in his hands, watching with undisguised pride as Grace rose from the piano bench to address the audience. Her burgundy dress complemented her chestnut hair, now arranged more elegantly than her usual teaching style, and the small gold locket around her neck, his engagement gift, caught the light of the oil lamps. Thank you all for coming tonight, she said, her clear voice carrying to every corner of the room. Your support of these children and their education means everything to me, especially as we approach this holiday season and my own new beginning. Knowing smiles and a few good-natured chuckles rippled through the audience. The upcoming wedding between Halsted Creek schoolteacher and Johnson Ranch's foreman had been the talk of the town for months, especially given the somewhat scandalous start to their courtship during last year's blizzard. As the crowd began to disperse, enjoying the refreshments provided by the town's women, Frederick made his way to Grace's side. She was accepting congratulations from parents, her face alight with the satisfaction of a successful event. "The children were wonderful," he said when he finally reached her, taking her hand discreetly. Grace's smile widened. "They worked so hard, even little Thomas Johnson remembered all his lines, though he was certain he would forget them." "His father mentioned he practiced day and night," Frederick replied. "Think we might have an actor rather than a cowboy in the making." Grace laughed, the sound still one of Frederick's favorite things in the world. Perhaps both. The West needs versatile young men. They moved together through the crowded room, accepting congratulations on both the successful pageant and their upcoming wedding, now just 2 weeks away. The past year had seen significant changes for them both, Frederick establishing himself as an respected foreman at the Johnson Ranch, Grace expanding the school's curriculum and starting adult education classes in the evenings. Through it all, their relationship had deepened and strengthened, built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared values, and an acceptance of each other's peculiarities that few would understand. Frederick had come to recognize the signs when Emily was present, the slight tilt of Grace's head, the occasional distracted glance at empty spaces, the rare whispered responses when she thought no one was listening. For her part, Grace had grown more adept at managing her spectral sister's presence, learning techniques to politely but firmly establish boundaries that allowed her to fully participate in her increasingly rich life in Halsted Creek. As the celebration wound down, Frederick and Grace worked alongside volunteers to clean the schoolhouse, returning it to its usual orderly state for classes the next day. When the last of the helpers had departed, they found themselves alone in the quiet room, the only light coming from a single lamp on Grace's desk. "Successful evening," Frederick commented, hanging the last of the children's coats on its proper hook. "Very," Grace agreed, her voice warm with satisfaction. "Though I must admit, I'm looking forward to a quieter celebration with just the two of us on Christmas Day." Frederick moved to her side, taking both her hands in his. 2 weeks, he said softly. 2 weeks and you'll be Mrs. Xavier." "It seems almost unbelievable," Grace replied, looking up at him with eyes that still held wonder at their journey. "A year ago, I was a lonely schoolteacher talking to ghosts and begging a handsome cowboy not to ask why." Frederick smiled at the memory, "and I was a man convinced the frontier was no place for attachment. That love was a weakness I couldn't afford." "We've come a long way," Grace said, leaning slightly against him, "both of us." "Speaking of which," Frederick began, his tone turning more serious, "I wanted to show you something before taking you home." Curiosity brightened Grace's expression. "What is it?" "A surprise," he replied, helping her into her coat, "but we need to take the wagon." Outside, Frederick's wagon waited, hitched to his favorite team of horses. He helped Grace up to the seat and climbed up beside her, guiding the horses through the quiet streets of Halsted Creek and out onto the snow-covered road that led toward the Johnson Ranch. But instead of following the main road all the way to the ranch, Frederick turned onto a smaller trail about 2 miles outside of town. Grace looked at him questioningly, but he merely smiled, encouraging her to wait and see. The trail wound through a stand of pines before opening onto a small clearing beside a frozen creek, the same creek that ran through Halsted Creek, but here it widened and deepened, creating a picturesque setting even in winter's grip. In the clearing stood a partially constructed cabin, its framework complete and walls partially raised. In the moonlight reflecting off the snow, it looked like something from a dream, the beginning of a home. Frederick brought the wagon to a halt and turned to Grace, whose eyes were wide with surprise. "Frederick, what is this?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Our home," he said simply, "or it will be by spring. Johnson sold me the 10 acres surrounding it at a fair price. Said a foreman should have his own place, especially one with a wife who needs to be close enough to town for her teaching duties." Grace's gloved hand covered her mouth, her eyes filling with tears as she took in the cabin's beginnings. "You've been building this all this time." "Whenever I could spare a few hours," Frederick confirmed. "The men from the ranch have helped and some of the townfolk too. It'll have 3 rooms to start, more than enough for us and space to grow if when the time comes." The implication of future family hung between them, a hope neither had yet voiced directly, but both had begun to consider. "It's perfect," Grace whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Absolutely perfect." Frederick climbed down from the wagon and came around to help her descend, his arms lifting her easily to the snow-covered ground. Together they walked toward the cabin, their boots crunching on the fresh snow. "I wanted you to see it before our wedding," Frederick explained, "to know that we'll have our own place, not too far from your school but with enough land for horses, maybe some cattle eventually. A proper start." Grace turned to him, her face luminous in the moonlight. "It's more than I ever dreamed possible when I came west," she said softly. "A home, a purpose. Someone who understands me completely." Frederick drew her close, his arms encircling her waist. "Is she here?" he asked quietly, the question now comfortable between them. Grace glanced to her left, a small smile touching her lips. "Yes, she approves of the cabin, says it reminds her of illustrations from the fairy tales we read as children." "High praise," Frederick observed, having learned that Emily's approval was not easily won. "Think she'll be comfortable here?" The question acknowledged what they both knew, that Emily would be part of their marriage in ways most people would never understand. It had taken Frederick time to fully accept this reality, but he had come to see Grace's continued connection to her twin not as madness but as an extraordinary extension of love that transcended even death. "She will," Grace confirmed, though she insists on the room with the eastern window for the morning light. Frederick chuckled, the sound forming a white cloud in the cold air. "We'll make sure there's an eastern window then." They stood together in the quiet clearing, surrounded by pines and starlight, the beginnings of their home before them and the promise of their future stretching out like the vast Montana sky. "I love you," Grace said simply, the words still new enough between them to carry special weight, ghosts and all. "And I love you," Frederick replied, drawing her closer still. "Ghosts included." As their lips met in a kiss that held both promise and fulfillment, Frederick Xavier knew that his life had been transformed in ways he never could have imagined that day in Silverpine when he'd found a beautiful woman talking to an empty chair. The frontier remained a harsh and challenging place, but no longer did he face it alone, convinced that isolation was the only path to survival. Instead, he had found in Grace Thomas the truth that had eluded him since his youth. That love wasn't a weakness but the greatest strength of all, capable of bridging worlds both seen and unseen, of healing wounds both acknowledged and hidden, of building a future bright enough to illuminate even the darkest corners of their pasts. And as they turned to walk back to the wagon, Frederick caught a glimpse of something from the corner of his eye, a flash of movement beside Grace, like a skirt swirling in a breeze that wasn't there. He smiled slightly, nodding in acknowledgement toward the space where Emily might be. After all, family was family, whether visible to all or only to some. And on the frontier, you learned to cherish every blessing that came your way, no matter how unconventional it might appear to others.